Hey, come over here.
Hope you can handle
Let's while away time with some
addition.
elementary mathematics. You do know addition and subtraction, don't you? Or perhaps they haven't
you
gotten
can
that
handle
far in your school yet.
simple addition.
The words carried across the marble study with the particular cruelty of someone accustomed to being correct, someone whose entire identity rested on intellectual superiority, someone who had forgotten or never learned that brilliance could exist anywhere, in anyone, often in the places we're least prepared to acknowledge it. Before you judge what happens next, pause for a moment, because stories like this only surface when we're willing to look past appearances. If you believe talent deserves recognition wherever it's found, stay with me. What unfolds in the next few minutes will challenge everything you think you know about genius, about class, about the assumptions we make when we look at someone and decide, without evidence, what they're capable of understanding. The speaker was Professor Theodore Harrington, billionaire, mathematical legend, architect of algorithms that had reshaped global finance, and he stood by his floor-to-ceiling chalkboard like a king surveying his domain. At 73, he carried himself with the particular confidence of men who had spent 45 years being the smartest person in every room they entered. His private study was a cathedral to that supremacy. Walls covered in equations that had stumped lesser minds, shelves groaning under the weight of academic journals bearing his name in author lists and footnotes, awards and plaques catching afternoon light through tall windows that overlooked gardens worth more than most families earned in a lifetime. The room smelled of old books, expensive leather, and chalk dust. The scent of accumulated wisdom, of knowledge carefully curated and jealously guarded. First editions of mathematical texts lined mahogany cases. A Persian rug, probably worth 6 figures, cushioned the floor beneath furniture that belonged in museums. Everything in this space announced authority, permanence, the kind of intellectual dominance that came not from a single achievement but from decades of consistent, undeniable brilliance. But today, Theodore Harrington was restless, bored, and quietly, viciously unsettled in a way he couldn't quite articulate even to himself. 3 weeks earlier, a doctoral student named Amanda Lee had presented him with an equation during her dissertation defense. A seemingly straightforward problem in abstract algebra that had somehow resisted his attempts at solution. It shouldn't have been difficult. By all conventional analysis, it was the kind of problem he should have solved in an afternoon, maybe a long evening if he was being thorough. Instead, it had sat on his desk like an accusation, like a small crack in the edifice of his self-conception. For 3 weeks, it had haunted him. He had approached it from every angle his decades of expertise could suggest. He had consulted former colleagues, now retired but still sharp, men and women who had once been his intellectual equals. He had lost sleep over it, waking at 3 a.m. to scribble new approaches on the notepad he kept beside his bed. And still, the solution eluded him, that rare and horrifying experience of his own intellectual limitation staring back at him from chalk and paper. It gnawed at him, not just the unsolved problem itself, but what it represented. The first real sign that perhaps his mind was slowing, that age was finally exacting its price, that the brilliance he had taken for granted for 7 decades might not be permanent after all. He found himself snapping at his staff over minor issues. He had canceled 2 speaking engagements. He had, in a moment of weakness he immediately regretted, actually Googled cognitive decline in aging mathematicians. So when he noticed 12-year-old Isabel standing quietly near the doorway of his study that Tuesday afternoon, waiting patiently for her mother to finish cleaning the upstairs library, something cruel and impulsive stirred in him. Something that wanted to feel superior again, to remember what it was like to be the teacher rather than the student, the authority rather than the supplicant. Something that needed to win, even if the opponent was a child who had never claimed to be competing. Isabel was the daughter of Gabriella, his housekeeper of 7 years, a woman who cleaned with invisible efficiency, who understood that in a house like this, silence was a form of respect, that the best service was the kind you never noticed. Gabriella had been widowed young, had worked multiple jobs to support her daughter, had eventually landed this position that paid better than anything else she'd found. She was grateful for it. She never caused problems. She never asked for anything beyond her salary and the occasional afternoon off for parent-teacher conferences. The girl often came after school, doing homework in corners, reading books in unused rooms, never making trouble, never drawing attention. Theodore had perhaps spoken to her twice in all those years. Brief words. Forgettable exchanges. Tell your mother the upstairs bathroom needs attention. Keep your voice down, please. I'm working. He had never asked her name, though he must have heard Gabriella use it. He had never wondered what she was reading, what she was studying, what thoughts moved behind those dark, watchful eyes. Today, for reasons he would later struggle to fully explain, he wanted to speak to her. Or rather, he wanted to speak at her, to reassure himself through her obvious limitations that his own capabilities were still intact, still superior, still worthy of the reputation he'd spent a lifetime building. Come on, don't be shy, he said, his tone light but edged with something darker, something that came from 3 weeks of private failure and mounting fear. I'm curious what they teach in schools these days. Probably not much, given the state of public education. But let's see what you've managed to pick up. Isabel walked forward slowly, her worn backpack still on her shoulders, her dark eyes cautious but not fearful. She was small for her age, with her mother's copper skin and thick black hair pulled back in a simple ponytail secured with an elastic band that had seen better days. She wore a faded blue dress that had probably been purchased at a discount store. He could tell from the quality of the stitching, the way the fabric hung, and sensible shoes that were clean but clearly old, the kind parents buy at thrift stores and hope will last another season. Everything about her suggested invisibility, the careful camouflage of children who grow up understanding they exist in spaces not designed for them, that their presence is tolerated rather than welcomed. Yes, sir. Her voice was soft, respectful, with none of the nervous energy most children showed in his presence. No fidetin, no giggling, just quiet attention, as if she were waiting for instructions that would tell her what role to play. Theodore picked up a piece of chalk, turning to a clean section of board. The chalk felt good in his fingers, familiar, controllable, his tool for explaining the universe to lesser minds. Let's see. What's 7 times 13? 91. The answer came instantly, without hesitation, without the visible mental calculation he'd expected. No looking up at the ceiling. No counting on fingers. No pause to work through the multiplication tables. Just the answer, delivered in the same calm tone she'd used to acknowledge him. Theodore paused, chalk hovering over the board. A small flutter of surprise moved through his chest, but he dismissed it immediately. Lucky guess, or perhaps she'd done this exact problem recently in class. He wrote the problem anyway, multiplied it out with deliberate precision, confirmed the answer. Try this. If I have a sequence starting with 2, 4, 8, 16, what comes next? 32. It's doubling. And if I change the pattern to 3, 6, 12, 24? 48. Still doubling, different starting point. Theodore felt the first real stirring of something that wasn't quite curiosity but wasn't quite comfortable either. The answers were coming too fast, too clean. He wrote out a simple algebraic equation, something any decent high school student should manage, but that would certainly stump a 12-year-old. 2x plus 7 is equal to 19. Solve for x. 6. He checked. She was right. He wrote another equation, slightly more complex, involving negative numbers and parentheses. 3x 4 equals 15. And this one, 9. Another check. Another correct answer. Theodore's hand tightened on the chalk. He wrote a word problem, the kind designed to test reading comprehension as much as mathematical ability. A train travels at 60 miles per hour for 2.5 hours. How far does it travel? 150 miles. Show your work. 60 times 2 is 120. 60 times 0.5 is 30. 120 plus 30 is 150. Each answer came cleanly, quickly, without the performative thinking he associated with children trying to impress adults. She wasn't showing off. She wasn't even trying to engage him in conversation. She was simply solving problems the way someone might breathe, automatically, naturally, without conscious effort or apparent pride in the accomplishment. If you've ever been underestimated, or watched someone else be dismissed too quickly, you'll understand why this moment matters. Because what's happening in this study goes far beyond mathematics. It's about power, about assumptions, about the stories we tell ourselves about who deserves our respect and who can be safely dismissed. Stay with this, Watch what happens when those assumptions collide with undeniable reality. Upstairs, Gabriella had stopped dusting. She stood at the top of the curved staircase, her hands gripping the polished banister hard enough to leave fingerprints on the wood, listening to the exchange below with growing dread. She knew her employer's moods, understood the particular tone of voice that meant he was testing someone, playing with them the way a cat plays with something small and helpless. She knew Isabel was brilliant, had always known it, had watched her daughter solve her homework with an ease that seemed almost supernatural, had found her reading university mathematics textbooks borrowed from the library that Gabriella herself couldn't begin to comprehend. But she also knew what happened to people who stood out in spaces where they were meant to be invisible. She knew the cost of being noticed. She had seen it before, in her own life, in Diego's life, in the lives of everyone she'd ever known who had tried to rise above their assigned station. The world did not reward ambition in people like them. The world punished it, found ways to cut it down, to remind them of their place. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to run downstairs, to pull Isabel away, to apologize to Mr. Harrington for the presumption of her daughter's competence. But she also wanted, God help her, she wanted to see what would happen if she didn't intervene. Wanted to see if maybe, just this once, brilliance would be recognized instead of resented. Down in the study, Theodore's amusement had curdled into something harder to name. He'd been expecting giggles, guesses, the charming incompetence of childhood. He'd been anticipating the satisfaction of gentle correction, of patient explanation, of reasserting his role as the one who knew while she learned. Instead, he was facing something else entirely. The girl stood there calmly, waiting for the next problem, her expression neutral, almost patient, as if she were the teacher and he the student who needed more time. The thought infuriated him, though he would have denied it if asked. Around the study, 2 other staff members had paused in their duties. William, the estate manager, who had been reviewing household accounts at a side desk, and Evelyn, the private secretary, who had entered to deliver messages and now stood frozen near the doorway. Both were watching now with barely concealed interest, their own work forgotten in the face of this strange performance. "Would you like harder problems?" Isabel asked quietly. The question hung in the air like a challenge, like an accusation, like a small hand reaching out to pull the curtain back from the great and powerful wizard. Theodore felt his jaw tighten, his face flushed. Something hot and ugly rose in his chest. Not quite anger, not quite fear, but something that combined elements of both. "Harder problems," he repeated, as if tasting the words, as if trying to understand how this child had the audacity to suggest his problems weren't challenging enough. "You want harder problems. If you have them, sir. These are interesting, but they're things I've seen before." The casual dismissal of his carefully selected questions he'd thought would challenge her, maybe even stump her, hit him like a physical blow. He felt suddenly, absurdly angry, though even in the moment he recognized the anger was irrational, disproportionate, revealing more about his own insecurities than about anything the girl had actually done. Something shifted in Theodore's chest, something that felt like anger but tasted like fear. He walked to his desk, where Amanda Lee's equation lay in a folder marked "Unsolved" in his own handwriting. He hadn't meant to touch it, hadn't planned this moment, but his hand was already reaching for it. Ego and pride and 3 weeks of accumulated frustration driving him toward a decision his rational mind would have counseled against. "All right," he said, his voice carrying a sharp edge now, the pretense of casual entertainment abandoned. "Let's try something truly challenging. Something that would defeat most graduate students. Something that has, in fact, defeated every graduate student I've shown it to." He began transcribing the equation onto the chalkboard, his handwriting precise despite the tremor in his fingers that came from equal parts age and emotion. It was an elegant problem, deceptively simple in appearance but treacherously complex in execution. A question about the relationship between polynomial functions and their roots, involving boundary conditions that seemed to contradict each other, requiring insights from multiple branches of mathematics to untangle. He'd spent hours on it, days, nights waking up thinking maybe he'd had a breakthrough only to find, in the morning light, that his midnight insight led nowhere. His doctoral students had attacked it from every theoretical angle they could construct. They'd consulted references, built computational models, tried proof by contradiction and proof by construction. And all of them had failed. When he finished writing, he stepped back, and his voice carried across the study with the weight of pronouncement, of judgment, of a wager he was certain he would win. This equation defeated my doctoral students, students who have studied mathematics for 6, 7, 8 years at the graduate level, students who have published papers, students who are, by any objective measure, among the brightest mathematical minds of their generation. And it defeated me. It has sat on my desk for 3 weeks, mocking me, resisting every approach I've attempted. He turned to face Isabel fully now, and in front of William and Evelyn, in front of anyone who happened to be listening from other rooms or hallways, he made a pronouncement he would later regret and eventually honor. If you can solve it, which, let me be absolutely clear, you cannot, I will personally sponsor your education in mathematics. College, graduate school, doctorate, postdoctoral work, whatever you want, wherever you want to study. Full scholarship. Full support. My personal guarantee. My word as a gentleman and a scholar. He said it as a joke, as humiliation masquerading as generosity, as the kind of impossible promise powerful men have always made, secure in the knowledge that the impossible would remain impossible and they would never be held to account, never face the consequences of their casual cruelty. This is the point where most people would look away, but if you stay, you're about to witness something rare. Something that happens maybe once in a lifetime if you're lucky. The moment when all our careful assumptions about intelligence and capability and who deserves our attention get turned inside out. The moment when the world reveals itself to be larger, stranger, more generous with its gifts than we'd ever imagined. Isabel approached the chalkboard slowly. She didn't touch it at first, didn't reach for chalk. She simply stood there, her head tilted slightly to one side, her eyes moving across the equation with the kind of focused intensity that Theodore recognized from his own reflection during moments of deep mathematical immersion. She was reading it the way a musician might read a complex score, looking for patterns, for relationships, for the hidden structure beneath the surface notation, looking for the places where the composer had made choices, where different paths might have led to different outcomes. 60 seconds passed, then 90. The room had gone completely silent. Even William had stopped pretending to work on his accounts. Evelyn stood absolutely still near the door, barely breathing. Gabriella, still upstairs, felt her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought she might faint, might collapse right there on the landing. Isabel reached for a piece of chalk. Theodore noted, almost absently, that her hand didn't shake. No nerves tremor. No hesitation. Just smooth, confident motion, the kind that came from certainty rather than bravado. She began writing beneath his equation, not erasing anything, not changing his work, but building underneath it like an architect adding a new foundation to an existing structure. Her handwriting was smaller, neater than his, the careful script of someone who had learned to conserve paper, to make every inch count, someone for whom notebooks and pencils represented real expenses that had to be justified and maximized. She introduced a new variable, something Theodore had considered but dismissed as unhelpful. She restructured one of the boundary conditions, showing how it could be expressed differently without changing its fundamental meaning, revealing a symmetry that hadn't been visible in the original formulation. And then, in a series of steps that Theodore followed with increasing disbelief, with a growing sense that the ground was tilting beneath him, she isolated the contradiction that had trapped him. She showed, with brutal clarity, exactly where the problem lay, not in the mathematics itself, but in the framing, in the assumptions embedded in how the question had been posed. It wasn't that the equation was unsolvable. It was that the way it had been framed contained an implicit assumption, an assumption so subtle, so embedded in conventional mathematical thinking, that even experienced mathematicians might accept it without question. The assumption was about the independence of certain variables, about relationships that seemed obvious but were actually contingent. Isabel had seen it. She had identified the hidden constraint that made the problem appear impossible, and then she had removed it, gently but decisively, allowing the solution to emerge naturally from the restructured framework. When she finished, she set down the chalk and stepped back, waiting in that same patient silence she'd maintained throughout. Theodore stared at the board. His mouth had gone completely dry. His hands felt cold. He checked her work once, following each step with his finger, his lips moving slightly as he worked through the logic. He found no errors. He checked it again, his chalk moving frantically now, his breathing becoming audible, a slight wheeze that came from age and emotion combined. He walked through every transformation, tested every assumption, looked desperately for the mistake that would let him dismiss this, let him return to the comfortable world where he was the master and she was the child who cleaned his home by proxy, by inheritance, by accident of birth. There was no mistake. The solution was perfect. More than perfect, it was elegant. It revealed a pathway through the problem that made the answer seem obvious in retrospect, that made him wonder how he'd missed it, how 3 weeks of effort had failed to produce what this child had found in 15 minutes. "My God," he whispered. The words came out cracked, broken, and then louder, his voice carrying across the study with a quality close to anguish. "My God, she's right. She's absolutely right." The words came out like a confession, like an admission torn from somewhere deep in his chest. Evelyn and William exchanged glances heavy with meaning. Upstairs, Gabriella felt tears sliding down her cheeks, hot and fast. Though whether they were tears of pride or terror or some overwhelming combination, she couldn't have said. Isabel stood quietly, waiting. She hadn't smiled, hadn't celebrated, hadn't performed any of the reactions he would have expected from a child who just accomplished something extraordinary. She had simply solved the problem and was now waiting for the next instruction, the next command, the way children from her world learn to wait, patiently, without expectation, ready to be dismissed at any moment. Theodore turned to face her fully. His face had changed, the smirking condescension replaced by something raw and honest. Shock, recognition, the devastating realization that he had nearly committed an act of intellectual cruelty against someone whose gifts exceeded his own, whose understanding of mathematics operated on a level he'd only glimpsed in a handful of people during his entire career. "Who taught you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "My father." "Where is your father?" "He passed away 2 years ago." The information landed like a blow, like a physical impact that made Theodore actually step backward. He felt suddenly, searingly aware of everything he'd assumed, everything he'd failed to see, every casual dismissal he'd performed in the course of this encounter. He looked at Isabel's worn dress, her second-hand shoes, the quiet dignity with which she stood in his mansion as if she had every right to be there, because, he now understood intellectually, she had more right than he did. Her mind was stronger, her understanding deeper, her capability beyond anything he'd imagined possible. "I need to sit down," he said, and did so, lowering himself into his leather desk chair with the careful movements of someone who had just discovered the ground was less solid than previously believed, that foundations he'd trusted his entire life were built on sand. Moments like this reveal more than intelligence, they expose bias. They expose the comfortable assumptions we carry about who deserves respect based on nothing more than appearance, accent, address. If you believe brilliance shouldn't need permission, if you believe talent exists everywhere and recognition is the scarce resource, keep watching. Because what comes next is going to force everyone in this story to confront truths they've been avoiding. What Theodore didn't know yet, what he wouldn't discover for several more days, was that when he took Isabel's solution to his colleagues in the mathematics department at the university where he still held an emeritus position, those colleagues would refuse to believe it. They would resist the evidence presented before them with a determination that bordered on willful blindness. Dr. Margaret Sinclair, who had published 3 books on abstract algebra and held an endowed chair in pure mathematics, actually laughed when Theodore suggested a 12-year-old had solved Amanda Lee's equation. Not a polite laugh. A dismissive laugh, the kind that carried decades of professional certainty. "Theodore, come on. That's impossible." Someone coached her, or she accessed a solution online. These kids today, they're very good at finding things on the internet. Professor Nicholas Brennan, department chair, suggested more directly that Theodore had been deceived, that perhaps his age was affecting his judgment, that grief over his late wife, who had passed 3 years prior, might be making him vulnerable to manipulation. These situations happen, Brennan said with careful diplomacy. People want to believe in extraordinary things, prodigies, miracles. But mathematics doesn't work that way. It requires years of training, formal education, systematic development. A 12-year-old girl with no formal mathematical education doesn't solve doctoral-level problems. It doesn't happen. The resistance infuriated Theodore in a way he hadn't felt in decades. Not because they doubted Isabel, though that was infuriating enough, but because they wouldn't even examine the evidence. They had decided what was possible based on who she was, not what she demonstrated. Their certainty came not from analysis but from assumption. "Come to my office tomorrow," Theodore told them, his voice tight with an emotion he couldn't quite name but that felt like righteousness, like the anger of someone who had seen truth and watched others deliberately turn away from it. "Bring problems. Bring your hardest unsolved questions. Test her yourselves. I dare you." The next day, in a conference room that smelled of old coffee and academic pride, of decades of self-importance accumulated and crystallized, 5 professors assembled what amounted to an intellectual firing squad. They brought problems from number theory, from topology, from differential equations. They brought their own unsolved research questions, the kinds of problems they assigned to doctoral students as dissertation topics, expecting months or years of work. They brought questions designed not to assess but to humiliate, to expose the fraud they were certain they would find. They took turns presenting these to Isabel, who sat at the end of a long table that made her look even smaller than she was, her mother standing against the back wall, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white, her face a mask of barely controlled terror. Dr. Sinclair started. A problem in group theory involving symmetries and transformations, the kind of question that required not just computational ability but deep conceptual understanding. Explain the relationship between the symmetric group of degree 5 and solvability by radicals. Isabel thought for perhaps 2 minutes. The symmetric group S5 contains a copy of A5, the alternating group, which is simple and non-abelian. Since the solvability of polynomial equations by radicals corresponds to the solvability of their Galois groups, and A5 is not solvable, we get the impossibility of a general quintic formula. The key is that A5 has no normal subgroups except itself and the identity. Sinclair's mouth opened, closed. She glanced at her colleagues. Professor Brennan tried next. A topology problem involving the fundamental group of a space constructed by identifying certain boundaries. Complex, abstract, requiring visualization skills that usually took years to develop. Isabel worked through it systematically, drawing small diagrams on scratch paper, building up the solution piece by piece. 15 minutes later, she had the answer. One by one, the professors threw their best problems at her. Not all of them were solvable on the spot. Some genuinely were beyond her current understanding, requiring theoretical frameworks she hadn't yet studied, mathematical machinery she hadn't encountered. But she solved enough of them. More than enough. She solved a problem in prime number distribution that had stalled one professor's research for 6 months. She identified a computational shortcut in a complexity theory question that made Dr. Sinclair actually gasp, actually place her hand over her mouth. She looked at Professor Brennan's topology problem for 15 minutes, then quietly pointed out that the question itself contained a logical impossibility, that he had unknowingly asked something equivalent to requesting a square circle, that the premises contradicted each other. Brennan checked. She was right. He'd been working on that problem for 3 years. The room grew colder, quieter. The professors stopped smiling. The air of playful skepticism, of indulgent testing, evaporated entirely. What replaced it was something darker, more uncomfortable, the recognition that they were witnessing something that shouldn't exist according to their understanding of how mathematical talent developed. Dr. Sinclair, to her credit, was the first to speak what everyone was thinking. This is extraordinary, but it's also impossible to accept without proper verification. We can't just take Theodore's word for it, no matter how much we respect him. What kind of verification? Theodore demanded, his voice sharp. A formal assessment, competition conditions, other students, blind grading, a proper academic setting with witnesses and documentation. You mean you want her to prove herself to you again, under circumstances where you control every variable? I mean, Sinclair said carefully, that what we're seeing contradicts everything we know about mathematical development. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If this child is truly this gifted, she'll be able to demonstrate it under rigorous conditions. And so, 3 weeks later, the university organized what they carefully termed a special mathematical assessment. Essentially a mathematics competition, though no one wanted to use that word officially, given that the participants ranged from undergraduate mathematics majors to current graduate students, and the youngest competitor was a 12-year-old girl whose mother cleaned houses. The optics were already problematic. Adding the language of competition would make them worse. The assessment would take place over 6 hours across 3 sessions. Problems would cover multiple disciplines within mathematics: algebra, analysis, number theory, geometry, topology, discrete mathematics. Participants would work individually, in supervised rooms, with faculty proctors ensuring no communication or outside assistance. Everything would be documented, filmed, made irrefutable. In those 3 weeks between Isabel's demonstration and the competition, Theodore did something he hadn't done in years. He investigated. Not mathematically, he could recognize Isabel's brilliance without investigation, but personally. He needed to understand where this child had come from, how this was possible, what combination of factors could produce this result. He spoke with Gabriella, gently, carefully, trying to overcome her natural fear of speaking too much, of revealing too much, of saying something that might jeopardize her job or her daughter's future. And slowly, through Gabriella's reluctant answers, through research he conducted online, through connections he still maintained in the international mathematics community, he learned about Diego Mendoza. Diego had been a mathematical prodigy in Buenos Aires, Argentina, one of those rare minds that appears perhaps once in a generation, capable of seeing patterns and relationships that others could only glimpse through years of study. By 20, he had published papers that drew international attention. By 25, he had job offers from elite institutions across 3 continents. Everyone assumed he would follow the conventional path. Doctorate from a top program, faculty position at a prestigious university, a career of publications and citations and gradual accumulation of honor. But Diego had no patience for academic politics, no interest in publication or prestige. He found the pace of academic mathematics frustratingly slow, the emphasis on publishing over discovering deeply distasteful. He disliked the competitive atmosphere, the constant jockeying for recognition and grant funding. He wanted to think about mathematics, not about his career in mathematics. So he had done something almost unthinkable. He had turned down those positions. He had rejected opportunities that would have made him famous, that would have secured him wealth and respect and the attention of everyone who mattered in his field. Instead, he had emigrated to work as a software engineer for a modest salary at a company that valued his problem-solving ability, but had no idea of his theoretical brilliance. He had married Gabriella after meeting her at a community center, attracted to her kindness and practical wisdom, and he had poured all his intellectual energy not into papers or proofs that would bear his name, but into teaching his daughter. He started when she was 4, Gabriella told Theodore, her voice thick with memory and loss. Not forcing her, never forcing, just playing. Mathematical games, pattern recognition. He would show her things, flowers, leaves, spiral shells, and ask her to find the mathematics in them. He said mathematics was a language, and if you learned it young enough, you could become fluent. Not just competent, fluent. He said most people learned mathematics like tourists learning phrases in a foreign language, just enough to get by. He wanted Isabel to think in mathematics, to see the world through mathematical eyes. And when he died, Gabriella's eyes filled with tears. Heart attack. Very sudden. No warning. Isabel was 10. She found him. Her voice broke. She found him at his desk, slumped over his notebook. For months after, she wouldn't speak, wouldn't cry, just sat in his chair, reading his notebooks, working through his problems. He left notebooks? 17 volumes. Handwritten. Every problem he ever found interesting, every proof he ever developed, his own way of thinking about numbers and patterns and relationships. He wrote them for her. He told me, a month before he died. We were talking about her education, about how we'd pay for college. He said, I'm writing everything down. Everything I know. If something happens to me, she'll have it all. Like he knew. Like some part of him knew he wouldn't be there to teach her himself. Theodore felt something shift in his understanding of the world. He thought about his own career, built on publications and citations and the accumulated prestige of institutional affiliation. He thought about Diego Mendoza, whose brilliance had died in obscurity, known only to his family and perhaps a few former colleagues who still remembered him. He thought about how much genius the world lost simply because it appeared in the wrong bodies, the wrong places, the wrong social contexts. How much brilliance was dismissed because it didn't come with the right credentials, the right accent, the right address. He thought about how close he'd come to dismissing Isabel entirely, to crushing her spirit with mockery, to denying her the recognition that might open doors for her future. If she hadn't solved that equation, if she'd failed or given up or simply refused to try, he would have forgotten about her within hours, would have gone back to his comfortable assumptions about class and capability and who deserved his attention. The realization made him feel physically ill. If you're still here, you already know, this story isn't about math anymore. It's about something larger, something that matters more than equations or proofs or intellectual achievement. It's about recognition, about dignity, about the choice we make every day to see people fully or to reduce them to our assumptions about them. And it's about what happens when someone finally chooses to see. The day of the competition arrived with the crisp clarity of early autumn, one of those perfect mornings when the air feels scrubbed clean and possibility seems tangible. The university had arranged for the assessment to take place in a large lecture hall, normally used for introductory physics courses. They had removed the usual tiered seating and arranged individual desks in rows, each positioned far enough apart to prevent any possibility of collaboration or cheating. 47 students had registered to participate, some genuinely interested in the mathematical challenge, others curious about the rumors circulating through the department about a child prodigy, still others motivated by the small prize money the department had hastily assembled to make the event seem legitimate rather than what it actually was. A test designed specifically for one person. Isabel arrived with her mother, wearing a new dress that Theodore had insisted on buying, though Gabriella had initially refused. They had compromised. One good dress, sensible but dignified, something that wouldn't make Isabel stand out but wouldn't mark her as different either. Navy blue, modest cut, appropriate for a child her age but suggesting she was taking this seriously. Theodore met them at the entrance, noting how Isabel's expression remained calm despite the buzz of conversation around them, despite the stares of undergraduate students twice her age, despite the weight of professors' eyes following her movements as she walked through the corridor. The first session began at 9 a.m. sharp. Problems were distributed face down on each desk, sealed in envelopes to prevent any possibility of advanced knowledge. At the proctor's signal, students tore open the envelopes and began working. The initial set covered foundational concepts, calculus, linear algebra, discrete mathematics, difficult certainly, but accessible to anyone with solid undergraduate training. Theodore, watching from the observation area alongside other faculty members, saw Isabel read through all 12 problems before picking up her pencil. She was taking inventory, he realized, deciding which problems to attempt first, planning her approach with the kind of strategic thinking that usually came only with experience. She worked steadily without apparent stress. Around her, other students chewed pencils, crossed out work, started over. Some made impressive progress. Several gave up on the hardest problems entirely, moving on to easier questions rather than wasting time on something they couldn't crack. Isabel moved through each question with what looked like methodical calm, her handwriting tiny and precise, her scratch work organized into neat columns that showed her reasoning process clearly. The second session, after a brief lunch break, raised the difficulty substantially. These were graduate-level problems, the kind that might appear on comprehensive exams or as warm-up questions in research seminars. Problems that assumed knowledge of advanced concepts, that required not just computation but genuine mathematical maturity. The room grew quieter, more focused. 2 students left early, recognizing they were outmatched. Others struggled visibly, managing perhaps 1 or 2 complete solutions among the 8 problems presented. Isabel solved 6 of the 8. The 2 she didn't solve, Theodore later learned from her scratch work, involved mathematical machinery she simply hadn't encountered yet. specific theorems from advanced topology and functional analysis that required prior knowledge she couldn't derive in real time, no matter how brilliant she was. But the 6 she did solve were perfect, complete, elegant in their efficiency, showing not just correct answers but genuine understanding of the underlying concepts. By the final session, starting at 4 p.m., the room had thinned considerably. Only the strongest students remained, the graduate students with years of training, the undergraduate mathematics majors who were already thinking about doctoral programs, and a few determined souls who knew they couldn't win but wanted to see the problems anyway, wanted to test themselves against the best. These final problems were cruel, the kinds of questions professors used to humble talented graduate students, to remind them how much they don't yet know. Questions that might take days or weeks of focused work to solve completely, if they could be solved at all. Isabel solved 4 of 7. Not perfectly. One solution had a minor gap in logic that she might have caught if she'd had more time, and another was incomplete, stopping at a point where she'd clearly run out of ideas and moved on rather than waste time. But 4 solutions to problems that most PhD students would struggle with for weeks. 4 complete, verifiable, mathematically sound answers produced in 2 hours by a 12-year-old girl whose mother cleaned houses for a living. When the proctor called time, there was a moment of profound silence. Then, slowly, a sound began. Not quite applause, but a murmur of recognition, of understanding. Several students looked over at Isabel with expressions that ranged from admiration to disbelief to something like grief, the recognition that they had just witnessed someone operating on a different level entirely, that all their years of training had been outpaced by a child who had learned from her father's notebooks. The verification process took 3 days. Faculty members checked every solution submitted by every participant, paying special attention to Isabel's work, looking for any sign of memorization or advanced knowledge of specific problems. They found none. What they found instead was original thinking, elegant reasoning, the kind of mathematical maturity that usually requires decades to develop. Her mistakes, where they existed, were honest mistakes, gaps in knowledge, not errors in reasoning. Her successes demonstrated understanding, not memorization. Dr. Margaret Sinclair, who had initially laughed at the possibility of a child solving advanced mathematics, requested a meeting with Theodore. When they sat down in her office, a cramped space filled with books and papers, the walls covered in mathematical diagrams and quotations from famous mathematicians, she looked older than he remembered, as if the verification process had aged her. "I was wrong," she said simply, without preamble or defense. "Completely, fundamentally wrong. That child is remarkable. Possibly the most naturally gifted mathematical mind I've encountered in 30 years of teaching. But Theodore, you need to be careful." "Careful how? She's 12. 12 years old. If we push too hard, if we put too much pressure on her too fast, we could break something. Genius is fragile, especially in children. Especially in children who've already lost so much." Sinclair paused, choosing her words carefully. "I've seen it happen. Prodigies who burned out by 20 because they were pushed to perform, to achieve, to justify the attention and resources invested in them. We have to be careful not to turn her into a circus act, not to make her identity entirely about her mathematical ability." Theodore nodded slowly. He had been thinking similar thoughts, had lain awake nights worrying about what he'd set in motion, whether his promise of support would help Isabel or ultimately harm her. "What do you recommend?" "Mentorship, not acceleration. Let her learn at her own pace. Provide resources, guidance, access to advanced materials. But don't throw her into graduate school at 13. Don't make her compete with adults. Don't force her to choose between childhood and achievement. Let her have both. If the story moved you, remember, sharing it might be the encouragement someone else needs today. Because stories like this don't spread on their own. They need people who believe that talent exists everywhere, that genius doesn't belong to any particular class or background, that recognition should be based on capability rather than circumstance. If you believe that, if you've ever been overlooked or underestimated, if you know someone who deserves more support than they're getting, share this. Let it remind people that brilliance is common. Recognition is rare. And we all have the power to change that, one moment of attention at a time. The formal announcement came 2 weeks later. The university, through Theodore's generous private donation, a sum large enough to endow a full scholarship in perpetuity, would establish support for Isabel Mendoza, covering her education from middle school through whatever terminal degree she chose to pursue. The scholarship included living expenses, books, tutoring, and access to university resources typically reserved for enrolled students. Isabel would continue her regular schooling, maintaining her childhood and friendships, but would also receive individualized mathematical instruction from faculty volunteers, including Dr. Sinclair and Professor Brennan, who had both offered their time without compensation. Theodore kept his promise, publicly, completely, without reservation. But what happened in the months that followed was perhaps more important than the scholarship itself. Theodore, who had spent 45 years being the authority, the expert, the man with answers, found himself becoming a student again. He asked Isabel to explain how she saw certain problems, how she thought about mathematical relationships. He showed her his own research, his own unsolved questions, and listened to her observations without defensiveness or ego. He learned that she thought in pictures more than symbols, that she experienced mathematical truths as geometric relationships existing in some internal space he could only glimpse through her descriptions. He learned that she had learned to be silent not because she lacked ideas but because she had learned, as her father had taught her, that knowing when to speak was as important as knowing what to say. That drawing attention to yourself could be dangerous when you were young, female, poor, and brilliant, when everything about you invited people to find reasons to dismiss your competence. Gabriella, watching her daughter work with these professors who had initially doubted her, felt something in her chest that she hadn't felt since Diego died. Hope. Real hope. Not the desperate hope of someone wishing for things to change, but the solid hope of someone watching change actually occur. Her daughter would have opportunities Diego never had. Her daughter would have the support and recognition that brilliance deserved, regardless of where it came from. 5 years later, Isabel Mendoza would publish her first paper in a mathematical journal at age 17, introducing a novel approach to a problem in number theory that had applications in cryptography. The paper would cite her father's notebooks as foundational sources, bringing Diego Mendoza's name into the academic record, preserving his legacy in the permanent literature of mathematics. 10 years later, she would complete her doctorate, with Theodore Harrington in attendance at her defense despite his advancing age, despite the difficulty of travel, because he needed to witness it. He needed to see what could happen when talent was recognized instead of dismissed, when assumptions were challenged instead of reinforced, when humility replaced pride. But all of that was future. In the immediate aftermath of the competition, in the weeks when Isabel returned to being mostly a child, doing homework, reading books, helping her mother when she could, Theodore found himself sitting in his study one evening, looking at the chalkboard where he had first transcribed Amanda Lee's equation, where Isabel had shown him the solution he couldn't find. He hadn't erased it. He'd left it there, a reminder of the day his understanding of the world had been reconstructed by a 12-year-old girl in a worn blue dress. Evelyn found him there, staring at the chalk marks in the fading light. "Sir, do you need anything?" Theodore shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "I have everything I need." He paused, then added, "Or rather, I'm learning what I needed all along." She didn't ask him to explain. She didn't need to. They both understood that some lessons arrive late, arrive inconveniently, arrive in forms we don't expect from sources we haven't learned to respect. And they both understood that the real question isn't whether we can learn those lessons, but whether we're willing to let them change us. Theodore Harrington had spent 45 years being brilliant. It took a single afternoon with Isabel Mendoza to learn wisdom. And in the end, that might have been the greatest equation he ever solved. The one that asked how much of yourself you had to give up to become who you were meant to be. The one that required you to fail before you could truly succeed. The one whose answer was always hidden in the places you were most certain held nothing worth finding. In Gabriella's apartment that evening, Isabel sat at the small table they used for meals and homework, working through problems from one of her father's notebooks. The pages were worn soft from handling. The ink sometimes smudged where Diego's hand had moved across it years before. She could still remember his voice, gentle and patient, asking her questions instead of giving answers, helping her discover patterns instead of memorizing rules. "What do you think?" he would ask. "What does the number tell you? What is it trying to show you?" She heard that question still in quiet moments. And she understood now, in a way she hadn't when he was alive, that he had been preparing her not just for mathematics but for a world that wouldn't expect her to understand it. He had given her not just knowledge but the confidence to trust her own thinking, even when everyone around her suggested she was wrong. "Thank you, Papa," she whispered to the notebook, to the memory, to the father who had seen her genius before anyone else believed it existed. Outside, the city continued its evening routine. Traffic moving, lights coming on, people finishing work and heading home. Ordinary life proceeding according to its predictable patterns. But inside that small apartment, and inside Theodore Harrington's mansion across town, and inside the university offices where professors were reconsidering their assumptions about talent and potential and who deserved their attention, something had shifted. Not everything. The world doesn't change in a day, doesn't reorganize itself completely because one girl solves one equation. Gabriella would still clean houses. Isabel would still face skepticism, would still encounter people who looked at her mother's profession before they looked at her mathematical ability. The machinery of class and assumption and ingrained bias doesn't dismantle easily. But some things had changed. Some doors had opened. Some minds had been forced to reconsider. And that, perhaps, was where justice lived. Not in the dramatic reversals of fortune that stories promise, but in the slow accumulation of moments when someone looked twice, questioned their assumptions, recognized talent they'd almost dismissed. Theodore understood that now, sitting in his study with the evening shadows growing long across his chalkboards and his decades of certainty revealed as incomplete. He understood that being intelligent meant nothing if you weren't willing to recognize intelligence in others. He understood that genius wasn't the rare thing recognition was. Support was. The willingness to look past appearance and circumstance and see the mind beneath. It was a lesson that had cost him his pride to learn. But it was also a lesson that had given him something more valuable than pride. The chance to be part of something larger than his own legacy. Something that would continue after he was gone. Something that proved brilliance existed everywhere, in everyone, waiting only for someone to notice, to nurture, to honor with the seriousness it deserved. And so the story ends not with triumph but with beginning, with a girl working through her father's notebooks, with a professor learning to listen, with a mother daring to hope, with a world slightly less certain of its assumptions and therefore slightly more just. Small changes, quiet changes, the kind of changes that only matter if you believe that every mind is worth finding, every talent worth developing, every person worth seeing completely. That's the mathematics that matters most in the end. Not the equations on chalkboards or the proofs in journals, but the calculations we make about each other, about who deserves our attention, who merits our respect, who we're willing to recognize as fully human, fully capable, fully worthy of the chances that let potential become reality. Theodore Harrington had asked Isabel a simple question that day. You do know addition and subtraction, don't you? Or perhaps they haven't gotten that far in your school yet. The answer, it turned out, was that she knew far more than that. But the more important discovery was that he had known far less than he thought, about mathematics, about teaching, about the difference between intelligence and wisdom, about the cost of assumptions and the value of humility. It was an expensive education, but it was also, in its own way, the most valuable one he'd ever received. And Isabel Mendoza, sitting in her small apartment with her father's notebook open before her, continued solving problems, one elegant proof at a time, writing her name into a future that would never forget where she came from or who had believed in her first. That future was still unwritten, but for the first time in her life, someone had given her the pen, the paper, the space to write, and she intended to fill every page with theorems and proofs and insights that would carry her father's wisdom forward, that would justify every sacrifice Gabriella had made, that would prove to every other child watching from the margins that brilliance doesn't need permission, doesn't need the right address or accent or credentials. It just needs someone willing to see it. And now, finally, Isabel had been seen.